would you look at this pile? Would you look at, can you believe that in the year of 2021, where I had multiple months where I read like 2 or 3 books, can you believe that this is my wrap-up pile? I know they're all very short. I know they're all about 150 pages because I was rushing through some books to get my Goodreads goal up. But can we just talk about the fact that I have 9 books? I have 9 books to talk about today. 9. And here's where we find out that I'm very out of practice at doing things quickly. Because in months where I've read 3 or 4 books, I can logistically spend about 5 minutes each on them, because that only ends up being a 20-minute video. That's not that long. But if I spend 5 minutes talking about each of these, that's like a 45, 50-minute video, which we all know no one has the patience to listen to me for that long. So we're gonna have to be brief and quick with this one. So I began the month with The Monsters of Brookhaven by Padre, and I believe this was a Christmas gift from B last year in Christmas 2020, and I finally got to it like a year later. Very full circle, we love that. And this is a middle grade sort of gothic, I wouldn't say horror because it's middle grade, but it's kind of gothic, eerie fiction for kids, obviously. Middle grade. So in this book we follow siblings Jem and Tom, who are on the run from their abusive uncle, I believe it is. So their father was off fighting and died in the war, and then I believe they lost their mother either from illness or some other circumstance, and they were staying with an uncle who was abusive. So they've run away, and at the beginning of the novel they are on the run. They've stolen a car and they're just sort of trying to find a place to camp out and hide for the night, and they stumble upon this old manor, Brookhaven, and it quickly becomes clear that this manor is inhabited by a bunch of monsters. Monsters who are obviously not very happy to find Jem and Tom intruding on their space, but the glamour that usually surrounds the castle mansion has been broken, and so there begins a journey to find out how that's happened and how they can protect themselves from outsiders. And the basic theme of this novel is that monsters are not always what we think. So things that appear monstrous are potentially kinder and sweeter than we may think, and people that appear normal and put together are potentially the most violent and most vicious and, you know, horrible. And I think that's a theme that I would have really appreciated when I was a young kid. I would have really enjoyed the illustrations that are throughout this book. They're very gothic, very eerie, very sort of Burton-esque. I really would have enjoyed those, and I enjoyed them now. But I think it's a little bit hard to avoid that with middle grade. You do feel like you're being taught lessons that you've already learned. You know, I'm a 24-year-old woman. I know that like that everyday people can be mean, and then people who look mean can be kind. Like that's a lesson that I learned as a child. But you know, if you haven't learned that yet, this would be a great book to read, or a great book to give to, you know, kids who like that sort of thing and kind of gothic vibes and like things that are like kind of monstrous and like a bit gory as well. There's like some like fight scenes and like some blood and gore and like a little bit, not too much. Like it's not traumatizing for your children, but definitely worth reading. And the next read of the month, spoiler, she made it onto my best books of the year, like immediately, and that was Scenes of a Graphic Nature by Caroline O'Donoghue. And it was almost scary how much this book felt tailored to me. So in this book we're following Charlie Reagan, who has graduated film school, and she has made a film with her best friend. She has a job at a cafe that is kind of paying her pennies. She's not really making a lot of money. She doesn't really know where to go next. She's not really progressed in her filmmaking career, and her best friend has. Her best friend's doing pretty well and, you know, is consistently employed, and she's been offered a job in LA, and so they're kind of on very different paths, and there is a little bit of bitterness there that, you know, Charlie feels that she's being left behind. And the film that she's made is one about her hometown of Ireland and her heritage there. So her dad was the sole survivor of a tragedy that happened on this island of Clipham in Ireland, and this tragedy was that the schoolhouse burnt down and her dad was like the sole survivor, and then it kind of broke apart the community, and it caused this ripple effect obviously that went on for generations. So Charlie has made a film about that and recreated those events, and then in the first section of the novel we find out that the film has been selected to screen at a film festival in Cork. So Charlie and her best friend, they go off to Cork to screen the film, and when they're there they meet some other people who know a little bit more about Clipham and the kind of legends around the island that sort of causes her to believe that there's a lot more to the story than her dad had initially told her. Now, in case I don't talk about it enough on this channel, I went to film school. I graduated into a pandemic. no prospects for me. So this was a story that hit a little bit too close to home. Charlie really feels like she is not talented enough to do the only thing that she's passionate about, and she's really scraping by, and she really feels like everyone else is like better suited at doing the thing that she's doing than her. Yep, that's all I want to say about that. The book is also sapphic, something which I also appreciate. So we have filmmaking, lesbians, friendships, slight bitterness, small town conspiracies, true crime, rural islands, literally all of the buzzwords that would make you read a book. It's just all rolled into this book, and it was absolutely incredible. I finished it so quickly, I wanted more immediately, and I'm just so excited to read anything that Caroline O'Donoghue publishes next. And so here begins my bid to read all the short books on my TBR so that I could hit my Goodreads goal, and that began with Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, and this is like 160 pages, and it reads extremely quickly because the language is quite simple. And we basically follow Keiko, who is a convenience store woman. She works in her local convenience store, and she has done for 18 years. And the people in her life are very perplexed at this, so like how she managed to stay at this convenience store, like why doesn't she get a real job, why doesn't she get married and have children and do the conventional thing. And this brings up a lot of questions in a way that's just not really bringing up those questions, if that makes sense. Like during the book I found myself thinking a lot about capitalism and gender roles and modern society and all of the things that we expect from women especially, but also men, but none of it is sort of explicitly explicit in the text. Obviously there's like hints and conversations around stuff like that, but it's not explicitly like capitalism is bad. It just gave me a lot to think about in terms of how little we value minimum wage like workers. Like the store that Keiko works at is open 24 hours a day. Like we all need 24-hour convenience stores, yet we look down on the people that choose to work there for longer than 1 year. For like, oh, what are you doing with your life? As if that's not a worthwhile way of spending your time when we all need those shops and we all need things from those shops. Like someone has to work there unless you want to be governed by robots or something. And then later on in the book, Keiko sees an opportunity in which she can sort of adopt this man that she's met who's also sort of flailing in his life, and she invites him to live with her because then she thinks, oh, if we live together, like people will stop bothering me about like settling down and all of this stuff. And it just doesn't work. Like people are still questioning her, like, oh, who's this random man, and like, is he good enough for you, and when are you gonna leave the convenience store? And it's just never good enough. And so it's all about sort of society's expectations and how even if you follow them, you're still not happy, and also society isn't happy either. Like the people around you still put you down and still compare themselves to you in unfair ways and still have expectations of you that you will never meet, because that's just what being a human is. So yeah, it's a lot to pack into arguably like not very much at all, but it's definitely one that I think I will return to, and one that I want to like read more people's reviews of, because like I said, there is so much stuff packed in here that I do feel like, especially because I read it quite quickly, that it's just taken me a while to like ruminate, but definitely recommend. Definitely blew my mind a little bit. And next up I read Misfits by Michaela, a personal manifesto, and Michaela is the writer and actress in Chewing Gum and I May Destroy You, two shows that I need to watch. But I wanted to read this because it's like a sort of written down version of a speech that she gave at some conference, I think, about sort of creativity and the pursuit of the arts and what that means and how to do it in a way where you don't lose your mind a little bit. And I enjoyed it. It was a little bit light for me. I kind of wanted a little bit more, but as it's just like a sort of, you know, speech, like it obviously wasn't going to hit all the points that I wanted it to hit because it was done for a very specific event and a very specific audience. So the title Misfits is basically about how anyone who's like pursuing the kind of creative dream is like, you know, a misfit, and the industry really seeks out misfits, you know, stories that are different, voices that are different, voices that are not the norm, so like black voices or disabled voices or working class voices, but then doesn't provide the infrastructure to actually nurture those voices. It's like they bring you in because like they see what you're doing and like, oh, we like that, we want that, but then once you're in, they don't provide the necessary care and like growth that, you know, people need in the industry if they want job security and things like that. So obviously a very valid topic and one that I wholeheartedly agree with, but I think just going into this I thought it was going to be a little bit more about the creative writing process, and because I know Michaela is a writer, she's a screenwriter, she writes her own content and performs in it and like, you know, creates opportunities for herself. And I sort of wanted more of an insight into that writing process and like writing roles for yourself, because the industry won't write those roles for you. And so the actual tangible process of how to actually write and how to better yourself and do so when an industry won't help you, essentially. But it was less about that and more about just the sort of general sort of workings of the creative industry, which is interesting but just not kind of what I expected. And I think I would have enjoyed it a little bit more had it been more about like the nuts and bolts of like actual craft and writing. But I enjoyed it nevertheless, and I do recommend it if you are someone who wants to go into the creative industries. It's not going to take you very long to read, and she makes a lot of really interesting points in a way that is very accessible and just fun to read. And next up I read Poison for Breakfast, which was a birthday gift from my wonderful friend Rowan, and I really enjoyed this. It was just everything you want from like a new Lemony Snicket book. I haven't read a series of unfortunate events for years, but it was one of my favourites growing up, and just I love returning back to this narrative voice and this writing style. So in this book we follow Lemony Snicket, and we don't get a mention at all of the characters from a series of unfortunate events. That world is kind of far behind in this book. We just are following Lemony Snicket, the journalist, the writer. And in the first chapter of this book, as he's having breakfast, he finds a note that reads, "You had poison for breakfast." And so he immediately panics and believes that his breakfast has been poisoned, and so he stops eating, obviously, picks up the note, and he goes off on this adventure to try and find out who poisoned him and how to undo the poison. So that's where we start, but it's not where we stay, if that makes sense. There's a lot of strange tangents in this book about philosophy and about the arts and about reading and about the joy of literature and the joy of stories. It takes a lot of different meandering paths, but I really loved it, and it was in Lemony Snicket's classic writing style, that classic narrative voice that we've all come to know if you've read the series of unfortunate events series. And he tells us at the beginning, I think the very first page is saying that this book is about bewilderment and the act of being bewildered, and that's what reading is. It's about being confused and then having those questions answered for you. Or not, essentially, which a lot of this book doesn't answer questions at all. Yes, the note says, "Dear reader, are you confused? Do you have any idea what is going on? Of course you are, and of course you don't. This book is about bewilderment, a word which here means not having the faintest idea what is going on at any given time. It is also something of a murder mystery in which a dreadful crime is investigated in the hopes of finding out what happened to the poor murdered victim. The person investigating is me. So is the poor murdered victim. The clues in this investigation include a suspicious stranger, an upsetting supermarket, the strange way literature is made, painful embarrassment, long songs, improperly prepared eggs, and other things which I happen to think are important. Some people might call Poison for Breakfast a book of philosophy, and hardly anyone likes a book of philosophy. When a person begins to investigate this bewildering world and their own inevitable death, they begin to suffer from a deeply troubling kind of bewilderment experienced by anyone foolish enough to love literature. Unless you are that sort of person, I recommend reading something else entirely. With all due respect, Lemony Snicket." So yeah, if hearing that intro did anything for you and made you curious, this is a book for you. And now we reach my first disappointment of the month, which was The Reader's Room by Antoine Lorraine, and I was so sad that I didn't love this book because it has everything that I think I would love in a book. So we follow Violaine, who is this sort of manager, chief person in the reader's rooms. So she manages all the people whose job it is to read manuscript upon manuscript that enter the publishing house, and they decide what gets published. And one day a book arrives that has them all up in a frenzy, that it's so good and they really love it, so they immediately publish it and enter into a dialogue with the author, who is like very reclusive and is not very responsive over email. And then the book gets nominated for this big award, and so they keep trying to get in touch with the author, like, please, we want to do press, we want to like have you involved, we want to really promote this book because it's up for this big award. And the author is just like not playing ball, and then suddenly the police show up and say there's been some murders that have happened, and they bear really startling similarity to the murders that happened in this book that you've just published that's up for an award. Can you please give us the details for the author? And chaos ensues. And I really love that premise. It just didn't deliver the way that I wanted it to, and I was sad about it. And it's really hard to go into the specifics of it without spoiling it, but just the ending, just the way things come together, which arguably is the best part of any sort of mystery crime novel, is the way things are revealed to you and the way that they pull back the curtain and say, haha, this is how it actually went down. That was just not a satisfying moment. The murders were pinned on this weird third party that you just didn't give a fuck about at all and was not set up in any way really, and so I was like, oh, that's not fun. And just the way it was like explained was just quite clunky. Like the police officer came into the room at the end and gave one character a pen and another character a pen and was like, write down the truth, and then you just read what those characters wrote, and that was like the ending. And I was like, oh, that's a bit shite. Like, I know that Agatha Christie, who's like my queen, I love Agatha Christie's cozy crime, tends to end with like Poirot sitting everyone down and explaining to them, but that's just done with like a lot more flair and a lot more tension, and I just thought it was just quite clunkily handled in this book. I don't know if that was like the book's fault or if it was like the translation or just something was off, but it just wasn't satisfying. And for a cozy crime, there are just a lot of weird tangents in here. There's a bit where the main character goes to Maine to visit Stephen King, and that just doesn't really matter at all in the grand scheme of the book. But then on the way back, she's in a plane crash and like it injures her leg. And at first I was like, ooh, like a plane crash, like somebody's planned this and like it's all suspicious. No, the plane crash is not relevant at all, apart from the fact that like in the plane crash she loses her memory a bit and then like just goes to her psychiatrist and is like, oh, what am I like, you know? And the psychiatrist explains stuff to her, so there's sort of like an element there of like, oh, is he telling her lies? But then that's not even followed up on. Like, that's not like a creepy thing, that's just like a thing, and he just tells her like stuff that she's forgotten. So it just I was unsatisfied. So if you want a cozy crime, I wouldn't point you in this direction, but if anyone's read anything else from this author, do let me know if it's worth reading, because I think he writes quite a lot of cozy crime, and I would maybe try another one. Just I hope that the ending is just like a bit better than this one. So but fortunately my next read blew me away, and that was Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss, and this is my first ever Sarah Moss book, and I was gagging. I swear to God, this book had me in its grip, and I just had no idea where it was going. Which is weird. Like, it's weird to describe it like that, because it's not like a thriller. It's actually a very, very slow book, so I don't want to try and like missell it to you, but I was just very gripped because I was interested. The way it is written is initially quite hard to get to grips with. It's very stream of consciousness, and I couldn't quite tell where we were. It never explains to you like, oh, I'm this character. Well, no books do that, but like I was never quite sure, one, what age the character is, who we're all with. Like it reveals itself very, very slowly. It doesn't set it up like, oh, you know, Sylvie, because the main character is called Sylvie, Sylvie and her parents are off on an archaeological dig with this guy and his class. That's what's happened, but it doesn't explain that to you. It just begins and it starts mentioning people's names and things that are happening. You're like, okay, sorry, what? And you have to catch up. But basically, we're following Sylvie, who is with her parents at this archaeological site with a professor and his sort of graduate class, and they're sort of pretending that they're back in the Iron Age. So there's no technology, they're like away from civilization, they're like trying to live how people would in the Iron Age as like a sort of academic, educational exercise. And I could never quite place how old Sylvie was meant to be, but she's quite young. She's definitely younger than the graduates, and I would maybe guess like 13, 14. And throughout the novel we see the sort of abuse, verbal and physical, that she experiences from her father. And I liked the way this was portrayed because it wasn't really given a lot of time on the page. So, you know, in a lot of books where like something big happens and then the structure of the page mirrors a like big event. So maybe you have like short sentences or like, you know, page breaks, line breaks, and like you just like something big is happening and a lot of time is devoted to it, and you're like, oh my god, huh. But in this book, when Sylvie is hit, or you know, when she's made fun of, it's not given a lot of time because of the stream of consciousness style. You move on very quickly, and it's quite jarring. You think, oh shit, did that really happen? And that really puts you in Sylvie's head of just trying to ignore it and trying to get through the day and just deal with the next thing, so that she doesn't have to take in the fact that her dad has hit her and that she's in pain and that her back is scabbed and people are going to be asking about it. And it was done so elegantly that I didn't realise how uneasy I was until we reached the end, which just left my jaw on the floor. I just did not think it would end in that way. And it just, yeah, left me very disturbed, which is weird because it's not a horror novel, there's no ghosts here, but just the sort of brutality of humans and the brutality of family, and the way that these people being back in nature sort of brought out this weird sort of animal undertone was just really quite unnerving, and I just thought it was expertly done, and I just immediately wanted more, and I wish that I could have like a sit down with Sarah Moss and be like, excuse me, where did this come from? Where is this idea coming from? Like, who are these people? What's going on? But yeah, just blown away, and it like more than made up for my disappointment with the other book that I'd read like immediately before this, because I was just like, literature, yes, feed me, thank you. And I'm gonna have to speed up because my battery is yelling at me. So we're ending with 2 comics. This one is Fox Bunny Funny by Andy Hartzell, which was gifted to me by my partner Kieran a couple of years ago, maybe last year. Time isn't real. And in this comic we follow a world where foxes and bunnies are at war, obviously, like natural sort of enemies, predator, prey. There's like a very clear divide between the two, and we're following a fox who sort of desperately wants to be a bunny and doesn't want to eat bunnies, and is just sort of trying to avoid violence and avoid the sort of expectations of being a fox. And then obviously this comes to a head, and there's lots of conflict in this, and it's basically a big metaphor for either queerness or I thought maybe transness because of the sort of ending of it, which I don't want to spoil, but it's, yeah, it was very thought-provoking, and it was entirely non-verbal. It was just illustrations, and it was really quite powerful, and there are lots of little details, and I really, really enjoyed my journey reading it. It took me about 20 minutes, but like it had a lot to think about, so it was like a very valuable like reading experience without having any words even to read. So it was very impressive in that regard, and yeah, definitely one I would recommend if you like comics. And then I ended the month and the entire year with Sour Pickles by Cleo Isadora, which I think I mentioned in my Christmas haul if that goes up before this, which I think it will. And this is a comic following Pickle in the lead up to her graduation from art school, and she's very stressed about having no money and having no one really value her art, and what she's going to do after graduation when like she's not going to have any financial support from her family or anywhere else pretty much to be an artist. No one really values art, and it's about having to maybe consider that this thing that you've been working towards for the last 3-4 years in university, or potentially longer, like let's be honest, like the thing you might be working towards your whole life, is maybe just not sustainable, and that is really sad and heartbreaking, and it's potentially not the one I should have like ended the year on. Like maybe I should have like finished with a more uplifting and like joyful energy to like welcome in the new year, but you know what? That's the reality of being a creative person. So if you are one and you struggle with being one, I would recommend this comic. It's quick and it's sweet, and it's really well illustrated, and I love the use of kind of like psychedelic colour that is used throughout, and yeah, it's big sad in it. So I've probably rambled on for far too long, so I'm going to make this outro really short and sweet. If you've read any of the books that I've talked about in this video, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much you stuck around this long, and I will see you very soon with another video soon. Bye.